The studio lights at Good Morning America always came on softly. Not harsh. Not aggressive. A warm, golden glow designed to make viewers feel safe before their first sip of coffee. The kind of lighting that flatters faces, smooths edges, and promises calm conversation. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a morning show. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The temperature inside the studio hovered just cool enough to keep everyone alert. Crew members moved quietly in the background, headsets tucked behind ears, coffee cups resting near soundboards. The giant screens glowed with muted blues and whites. Patriotic but restrained. Professional. Controlled. This was a place where narratives were usually guided gently. Where conversations stayed inside invisible guardrails. Nothing unexpected. Nothing explosive. Michael Strahan sat comfortably in his chair, shoulders relaxed, posture open. He'd been here thousands of times before. Former NFL titan turned morning television staple. A man whose presence alone filled space. When he smiled, the room followed. When he spoke, people leaned in. Years of tackling quarterbacks had trained him to read pressure, to anticipate impact, to believe, deep down, that he could handle anything coming his way. Across from him sat Caroline Leavitt. She didn't fidget. She didn't adjust her jacket. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers loosely interlaced. Her posture was upright. Composed, almost unnervingly still. The red of her blazer stood out against the neutral set, sharp without screaming for attention. Her expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive either. It was alert. Focused. Like someone who had already walked through this conversation in her head and knew exactly where it would go. The cameras rolled. The red light blinked on. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. There's a moment on live television, barely perceptible, when intention becomes clear. When a host leans forward just a fraction too much. When a question isn't just curiosity, but positioning. Strahan's voice stayed smooth, friendly, practiced. The tone of a man inviting discussion, not confrontation. But the words themselves were sharpened carefully. He brought up the federal workforce buyout. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Bureaucratic. Policy-heavy. The kind of topic that usually drifts past viewers without much resistance. But underneath it was an accusation wrapped in politeness. A suggestion that the administration was reckless. Cold. Willing to toss workers aside in the name of efficiency. Strahan asked how many employees the administration hoped would take the buyout. By what percentage the federal workforce would shrink. A setup. The kind of question designed to force hesitation. To make a spokesperson stumble into vague language. To create a soundbite that could later be framed as uncaring. For a split second, the studio felt very quiet. Caroline didn't rush her answer. She inhaled slowly. Not because she was nervous, but because she was choosing her moment. Her eyes didn't dart to producers. She didn't glance at notes. She looked directly at Strahan, voice steady, cadence deliberate. She reframed everything. This wasn't a mass firing, she explained. It was voluntary. A choice. 8 months of paid leave for those who wanted out. Not a pink slip. Not a purge. A generous exit for people who no longer wished to serve under the administration's expectations. You could feel it then, the subtle shift. Strahan's eyebrows lifted just a touch. Not alarm. Just recalibration. This wasn't the response he'd planned for. The narrative didn't land where it was supposed to. The words voluntary and paid leave floated in the air longer than expected. And Caroline wasn't done. She leaned slightly forward now. Just enough to signal confidence without aggression. And then she dropped the statistic. Only 6%. 6% of federal employees in Washington, D.C., were showing up to the office. The number landed heavy. It echoed in the studio, rippling outward through living rooms across the country. Viewers sitting at kitchen tables. Nurses getting off night shifts. Teachers packing lunches. Construction workers tying boots. People who didn't have the luxury of logging in from home. Caroline's voice didn't rise when she said it. That was the unsettling part. No anger. No theatrics. Just fact. Calm. Controlled. She talked about the buildings. The massive federal offices. Heated, lit, maintained with taxpayer money. Empty. While Americans worked in person every day, the people paid to serve them stayed home. You could almost see the producers exchanging glances behind the cameras. This wasn't going how it usually went. Strahan shifted in his seat. One leg crossed, then uncrossed. His smile tightened just slightly. He nodded along, but the rhythm was off now. The conversation had tilted. Caroline wasn't defending. She was prosecuting. She spoke about teachers, nurses, law enforcement, people who couldn't Zoom their responsibilities, people who showed up because society depended on them. And then she drew the line, quietly, decisively. The administration wasn't asking for anything extraordinary. Just that federal employees do the job they were hired to do. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Strahan tried to recover, leaning back into familiar territory. His voice stayed friendly, but the urgency crept in. He pivoted toward doctors and scientists. Specialists. Professionals. The implication hung unspoken, surely they couldn't be expected to work in an office every day. This was supposed to be the escape hatch. Caroline didn't blink. Her response came faster this time, sharper. Doctors can't diagnose patients from a couch. Scientists can't run labs from kitchen counters. Reality isn't optional. The job defines the setting, not the other way around. Somewhere off camera, a producer exhaled. Strahan laughed lightly, the way hosts do when momentum slips. A reflex. A pressure release. But the rhythm never fully returned. Caroline had found her footing, and she wasn't giving it up. She explained the return-to-work directive calmly. Agencies were to develop policies. Employees who didn't want to comply had an option: resign, with 8 months of pay. No coercion. No chaos. And if even a small percentage chose to leave, taxpayers would save tens of billions. The word billions lingered. Strahan glanced down for half a second. Maybe at his notes. Maybe at nothing at all. The studio lighting felt brighter now. Warmer. Almost too warm. And then came the pivot. Federal assistance programs. This was the emotional terrain. The moral high ground. The place where accusations could sting. Strahan referenced the freeze, the court intervention, the concern that even the government didn't know what programs would be affected. This was where interviews like this usually turned. Caroline listened. Let him finish. Didn't interrupt. Didn't rush. And when she spoke again, her tone shifted, not defensive, but explanatory. This wasn't a cut, she said. It was a pause. A review. A necessary audit of a sprawling, tangled system bleeding money without accountability. She made one thing unmistakably clear. Essential programs were untouched. Social Security. Medicare. Medicaid. SNAP. Business as usual. The relief that rippled through viewers at home was almost palpable. Strahan nodded slowly, but his posture stiffened. He was running out of room. The freeze hadn't produced panic. The buyout hadn't produced outrage. The narrative he'd walked in with was unraveling thread by thread. And then Caroline mentioned waste. Real waste. Government-funded studies that sounded absurd. Programs still being funded despite executive orders ending them. Policies no longer in effect, but still draining taxpayer dollars. Her voice didn't sharpen. But the implication did. Strahan swallowed. The interview wasn't over. But the balance of power had already shifted. And as the cameras kept rolling, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't a gotcha interview anymore. It was something else entirely. And the most dangerous moment hadn't even arrived yet. By this point, the studio no longer felt like a morning show. Something invisible had changed in the air. The soft gold lighting still washed over the set, the cameras still glided silently on their tracks, but the warmth had thinned. The temperature felt sharper now. Like the moment before a storm breaks. Crew members leaned forward in their chairs. No one was scrolling. No one was chatting in headsets. Every eye was locked on the exchange unfolding in real time. Michael Strahan sensed it too. You could see it in the way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw tightened just a fraction. This wasn't the flow he was used to. Interviews on morning television were supposed to feel collaborative, gently guided, predictably framed. Guests stayed inside the lines. Hosts steered the narrative. And when things got uncomfortable, there was always a commercial break waiting like a safety net. But Caroline Leavitt wasn't drifting toward the net. She was walking straight through the middle of the stage. Strahan tried to reset the tone. His voice softened again, almost reassuring, as he pivoted toward the Medicaid portal issue. A technical disruption. Systems going down across the country. This, finally, felt tangible. Concrete. A sign of disorder. A crack in the armor. He framed it carefully, planting concern into the question. Should that have happened? Wasn't this evidence of a chaotic rollout? The word chaotic hung in the studio like smoke. For the first time since the interview began, Caroline paused longer than a breath. Not hesitation. Calculation. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing, not in irritation, but in focus. Then she spoke. No. Absolutely not. Her response landed clean and firm. They were aware of the issue immediately. It was corrected immediately. The system was back online. Fully functional. No ongoing disruption. No damage. No crisis. As she spoke, something subtle happened. The tone of certainty replaced the tone of explanation. This wasn't damage control. This was closure. Strahan nodded, but the movement was slower now. His hands rested flat against his knees. The question had backfired. Instead of chaos, the audience saw competence. Instead of panic, responsiveness. And Caroline wasn't finished. She added the warning, not dramatic, not accusatory, just factual. Spreading misinformation during moments like this only fuels unnecessary fear. People depend on these systems. Words matter. The implication was unmistakable. This wasn't just a bad question. It was a dangerous one. Strahan's smile flickered. Barely noticeable, but it was there. The kind of expression that appears when someone realizes they're no longer steering the conversation. When they're reacting instead of directing. The producers behind the cameras shifted again. And then came the pivot that everyone in the control room knew was coming. The Kennedy card. Strahan leaned forward, signaling urgency. Another topic. Another angle. His delivery sped up slightly, like a quarterback sensing pressure and releasing the ball early. RFK Jr. confirmation hearing. Caroline Kennedy's comments. Words like dangerous, unqualified, predator. This was meant to sting. This was meant to provoke. This was supposed to force defensiveness. For a fraction of a second, the room went still. Caroline's expression didn't harden. It sharpened. She rejected the comments fiercely, not emotionally, but decisively. Her voice didn't rise. It anchored. She spoke of RFK Jr.'s record. His decades of work. Environmental advocacy. Legal battles. Research. Accountability. She reframed him not as a fringe figure, but as a man deeply embedded in public service. Strahan blinked once. Then again. This wasn't a sidestep. This was a full counter-narrative, delivered without hesitation. Caroline talked about health. Real health. Obesity rates. Autism rates. A nation rich in resources yet struggling in outcomes. She didn't attack institutions outright, but she questioned them. Calmly. Relentlessly. And that was the most unsettling part. There was no spectacle. No shouting. Just logic unfolding in real time. The cameras cut briefly to a wider shot. Strahan sat back now, arms resting against the chair, posture no longer dominant. He listened, nodding occasionally, but his role had shifted. He wasn't interrogating. He was receiving. The audience at home could feel it. The comment sections would later explode with it. This wasn't spin. This wasn't evasion. This was a spokesperson owning the frame. Caroline finished her point by reaffirming Trump's support for RFK Jr. clear. Unapologetic. Confident. And then, silence. Not the awkward kind. The kind that signals impact. Strahan inhaled through his nose, lips pressing together for just a moment too long. He was running out of runway. The interview clock was ticking. But the usual emotional payoff never came. No stumble. No apology. No viral gotcha clip. Instead, he had handed her moment after moment, and she had taken every single one. The studio felt smaller now. More intimate. Like a courtroom after closing arguments, where everyone knows which side just landed the final blow, but no one has said it out loud yet. Strahan tried to wrap it up. His voice returned to neutral. Professional. Controlled. But the energy had already left his hands. Caroline delivered her closing thoughts with the same steady cadence she'd held all morning. America deserved efficiency. Transparency. Accountability. And leadership that didn't flinch under pressure. She thanked him. The cameras cut. But the moment didn't end. Because what happened next wasn't just about the interview. It was about how quickly the narrative began to spread. Phones buzzed in production booths. Clips were already circulating. Producers whispered. Assistants scrolled. Social media timelines ignited in real time. Viewers weren't debating the policy anymore. They were reacting to the performance. Strahan stood, offering a polite handshake. Caroline returned it. Firm and brief. No victory smile. No smugness. Just composure. As she walked off set, the studio lights dimmed slightly, resetting for the next segment. Another guest. Another topic. Another attempt at normalcy. But nothing felt normal. Because everyone in that room knew, this wasn't going to stay inside the studio. This was about to explode online. And once it did, the fallout would be impossible to control. Because the media hadn't just failed to corner Caroline Leavitt. They had handed her a national stage. And she had used it perfectly. But the real impact, the backlash, the praise, the viral reckoning, was only just beginning. By the time Caroline Leavitt stepped out of the studio, the day had already moved on without her. New segments were being prepped. Makeup brushes were being cleaned. Teleprompters reset. The machinery of morning television rolled forward the way it always does, efficient, detached, indifferent to what it had just produced. But outside that building, outside that controlled ecosystem of lighting and rehearsed transitions, something else was happening. The internet had noticed. Not slowly. Not cautiously. Instantly. Clips began surfacing before the broadcast had even finished airing in every time zone. 30-second segments. 60-second cuts. Side by side. Reaction videos. Headlines sharpened themselves in real time. Screens filled with frozen frames of Caroline mid-sentence, eyes locked, posture steady, words captioned in bold white text. Voluntary buyout. Only 6%. Essential programs untouched. Each phrase became a weapon, or a shield, depending on who was sharing it. In media offices across the country, producers watched the clips roll in. Some with admiration. Some with frustration. Some with quiet dread. This wasn't the outcome they'd anticipated when the booking was made. The segment was supposed to be another routine exchange, firm questions, careful answers, tidy conclusions. Instead, it had turned into a referendum on authority. On composure. On who controlled the narrative when the script fell apart. Michael Strahan didn't comment immediately. He didn't have to. His expression from the interview had already become part of the story. The pauses. The tightened smiles. The moment when the host stopped pressing and started absorbing. Viewers didn't need a statement. They'd watched it unfold in real time. Caroline, meanwhile, didn't rush to social media either. That, too, was noticed. No victory lap. No inflammatory posts. No gloating. Just silence. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than any tweet ever could. It reinforced the image viewers had already formed, a spokesperson who didn't need theatrics. Who didn't rely on outrage. Who trusted the weight of her words to carry on their own. And they did. Comment sections exploded. Not with confusion, but with alignment. People argued, yes, but they argued about substance. About work. About accountability. About whether government service should mirror the expectations placed on everyone else. The conversation shifted away from personalities and back toward principles. That's when the media class grew uncomfortable. Because this wasn't a scandal they could contain. It wasn't a gaffe they could loop endlessly. It was competence. And competence is difficult to discredit. Pundits tried, of course. They questioned tone. They reframed intent. They cherry-picked phrases. But something had already calcified in the public consciousness. Caroline Leavitt hadn't walked into that studio as a guest. She had walked in as a test. And she passed. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Viewers saw a spokesperson who didn't dodge questions, but dismantled them. Who didn't rely on slogans, but statistics. Who didn't crumble under loaded narratives, but calmly exposed their assumptions. This wasn't about left versus right anymore. It was about preparation versus performance. And on that stage, there had been a clear winner. Late that evening, clips continued circulating. Reaction videos stacked millions of views. Titles grew bolder. Thumbnails sharper. Words like SmackDown, Masterclass, unraveled dominated timelines. The same networks that had hosted the interview now found themselves reacting to it, dissecting it, debating it. But none of them could rewrite what people had already seen. A calm voice in a controlled studio. A series of questions meant to corner. And a refusal to be cornered. That's why the moment lingered. Not because it was loud. But because it was precise. Caroline Leavitt had done something rare in modern political media. She hadn't just survived the interview. She had reversed it. She turned a platform designed to challenge her into a mirror, one that reflected the media's own assumptions back at them. And once viewers saw that reflection, they couldn't unsee it. Michael Strahan remained a legend. On the field. In television history. But on that morning, in that studio, he had stepped into an arena that no longer played by the old rules. The rules where confidence alone carried the day. Where authority went unquestioned. Those rules had changed. And Caroline knew it. That's why Trump picked her. Not because she could shout louder, but because she could stand firmer. Because she understood that power isn't about dominance. It's about clarity under pressure. It's about not blinking when the narrative leans in too close. And in that sense, the interview wasn't a clash at all. It was a demonstration. A reminder that truth, delivered calmly, can be more disruptive than outrage ever will be. So when the dust finally settled, when the studio lights cooled and the headlines moved on, one thing remained clear to everyone who watched it unfold: this wasn't just another morning show segment. It was a turning point. And moments like that don't fade quietly. They echo. Long after the cameras stop rolling.